Hello, and welcome to America's Veterans. My name is Len Sorotsky, and I will serve as your host. Today's program is different from all other programs in the past because our veteran is not with us. It is also a bit different from all programs in the past because almost every single person in the audience knows the name of this particular militia captain. In a 1910 book called 4-Minute Essays, it says that if you ask what kind of people are Americans, there stands our truest representative, Abraham Lincoln of Illinois. When the Creator made this boy, he wrote common all over his face and form. It was his commonness that made him great. He was government for the people. I did not know Abraham Lincoln personally. I wish that I had. I was born in a house in Chicago, just a short walk to Lincoln Avenue, and a little beyond that was Lincoln Park with a beautiful statue of Mr. Lincoln. So in a way, I grew up with him and I learned much about him. We had certain things in common. He was 6'4" and I am 5'4". He weighed 180 pounds and I weigh 180 pounds. We're very much alike. But let's start in the beginning. And the beginning was when the first member of the Lincoln family came to America. And that would have been Samuel Lincoln, who came to America with a group of friends in 1637. You have to say great 4 times in order to understand that Samuel Lincoln was the 4 greats grandfather of Abraham Lincoln. He and his friends moved out of Boston down the South Shore, and they established Hingham, Massachusetts, and it's still there today. The Lincoln family were in Massachusetts, but they moved around a lot. They moved to New York and to New Jersey, Pennsylvania, eventually down to Virginia, where his grandfather, Abraham Lincoln, went through the gap, the Cumberland Gap, in the 1780s. And in 1786, he was out in the field with his 3 sons, and he was killed by Indians. His son Thomas settled around Elizabethtown. He was a farmer and a carpenter. And the ownership of land in Kentucky was somewhat difficult. And I wanted to show you that where Tennessee, Kentucky, and Virginia kind of come together, this is the Cumberland Gap. And most of the people, who went west, used that Cumberland Gap as a way to pass through. And the Lincoln family settled over in this part of Kentucky, and they moved around several times, and we'll get to that in just a minute. Thomas was a nice man, always poor. He met a young lady, Nancy Hanks, who was a seamstress when he met her. And she also came through from Virginia, but she was traveling at the time with her mother. Thomas could write his name. He could write it. But it was a painful thing for him to do. He didn't like that. And he was not in favor of his son trying to spend time in books and trying to read and all that kind of stuff. Because, of course, if he was reading a book, he wasn't working in the fields. So he never liked that too much. Nancy was a very lovely girl. She came from that part of Virginia that we now call West Virginia. And they were married. She married Thomas in 1806. In 1807, she had her first child, and that was Sarah Lincoln. And this particular painting was done by an artist named Lloyd Ostendorf. Nancy was a great mother. Their first home was this one, and it's a one-room dirt floor place, and they were always poor. Eventually, they moved out of this cabin to the next cabin, just down the road a little ways, really. It was called the Sinking Spring Farm. And on Sunday, February 12, 1809, Abraham Lincoln was born. 2 years after that, they moved to a place called Knob Creek. And Abraham had a brother born named Thomas, and he died at childbirth. Sarah, by the way, his sister, lived long enough to get married, but then she died at childbirth. So of the 3 children that Thomas had, Abraham was the only one who made it. Today, in order to see the Abraham Lincoln birthplace, you have to travel up this long, long line of stairs. One of the interesting things, an interesting story, I don't think it's true, but there was a story that Nancy was having a very hard time with childbirth. Thomas had asked his neighbor to see if he could get him a midwife or a doctor. His neighbor came back over and said, "Tom, the doctor's out of town and I can't get a midwife." So Thomas didn't know what to do, and suddenly there was a knock on the door, and there was a young lady there named Sarah Parsons. And Sarah said to Tom, she said, "I'm a midwife and I can help your wife." And so she did. And when she was ready to leave, Thomas said, "That was an awful lot of work. Let me pay you." And she said, "No, I have no need for money." She said, "But I would ask that you name your son Abraham." Thomas, after the young lady walked out the door, Thomas felt obligated to give her some money or something. So he went out the door after her, and she was gone. And so he realized immediately it was an angel. And so he named his son Thomas Abraham. Nancy Hanks, in the meanwhile, was buried in this fairly simple grave. And this grave is in Little Pigeon Creek, Indiana, where the Lincoln family moved to get out of Kentucky because he had great trouble trying to hold land in Kentucky. Nancy died from milk sickness. Milk sickness comes from when cows eat a poison weed. It's called white snake root weed. Well, she died at age 34 on October 5, 1818, and Abraham remembers making the pegs for her coffin. He always thought that his mother was the angel. Long after Nancy Hanks died, poet Rosemary Benet wrote the following: "If Nancy Hanks came back as a ghost, seeking news of what she loved most, she'd ask first, 'Where's my son? What's happened to Abe? What's he done?' Poor little Abe, left all alone except for Tom, who's a rolling stone. He was only 9 the year I died. I remember still how hard he cried, scraping along in a little shack with hardly a shirt to cover his back, and a prairie wind to blow him down, or pinching times if he went to town. You wouldn't know about my son. Did he grow tall? Did he have fun? Did he learn to read? Did he get to town? Do you know his name? Did he get on?" Julius Silberger wrote a reply: "Yes, Nancy Hanks, the news we will tell of your Abe, whom you love so well. You ask first, 'Where's my son?' He lives in the heart of everyone." About a year later, Thomas thought, I need a woman in this house. And so he went back to Elizabethtown. This was only a year later. And he went back to Elizabethtown looking for a woman who would marry him. And he asked he found this lady, and he said she had lost her husband. And so her name was Sarah Bush Johnston. And he said, "Sarah, how'd you like to marry me? You know, I'm a nice guy, stuff. I live in Indiana." And she said, "Okay, that's a good deal." So she took her 3 children plus a small book collection and went to Indiana. And Abraham really got close to Sarah Bush, and he was in touch with her for the rest of his life. Abraham spent 14 years of his life in Indiana, from 1816 to about 1830. At age 8, Thomas gave Abraham an axe as a gift so that he could split rails, and hence he became known as the Railsplitter. Well, one thing I want to tell you is that during the same time that the Lincolns were living in Illinois, right next door to them, where they eventually would go, is Illinois. What I want you to notice, here's Illinois. What I want you to notice is that the far south part of Illinois is actually way farther south than Richmond, Virginia. Kind of interesting. And when people would come through the Cumberland Gap and they would come through Kentucky, many of them would go up Illinois because the land was so wonderful there. And so while Lincoln, the years that he spent in Illinois were right across the Ohio River, right down there. And then eventually he got tired of Indiana and went over to what is today Decatur, Illinois. And the story will go on. Abraham, the Railsplitter, Abraham, in 1830, he decided that he wasn't going to live with his father any longer. He decided that he would live in a place called New Salem, Illinois. He was very strong and very big at 6'4". And when he was 19 years old, he took a flatboat trip down to New Orleans. And instead of going back to Dad, he took a canoe ride up to New Salem. That was in 1831. He spent quite a bit of time on the Sangamon River, and he noticed that the boat frequently ran into high ground. And so Abraham Lincoln, among all the other things that he did, he is also the only president to ever get a patent. It's patent number 6469, and it was approved in 1849 for raising boats when they get snagged. Well, New Salem was just a very new little town. Abe had no place to live, so he lived everywhere. And he was very strong, remember. So he worked for a storekeeper named Denton Offutt. And Denton would tell anybody that Abe was so strong that he could take on anyone. Well, there was a gang called the Clary Grove Boys. They were tough and they were nasty guys. And the leader of the Clary Grove Boys was Jack Armstrong. And Denton Offutt, the store owner, said, well, I know Abe could take you. And so they finally agreed to wrestle. And while they were wrestling, Jack Armstrong tried to trip Abraham. Now, that was a dirty trick, and Abe didn't like that. That's not fair in wrestling. And so he got angry, and he grabbed Jack Armstrong around the neck with his two hands, and he lifted him off the ground. At that point, the whole Clary Grove Boys, the whole gang of them, moved in on Abraham. And Abe just dropped Armstrong, and he said, hey, I'll take you on one at a time, okay? Well, they fought to a draw that day, and but the fact was that Jack Armstrong learned to really appreciate Abraham Lincoln. Now, at the same time, there are no pictures to demonstrate this, but at the same time, in 1832, there was an Indian chief in northern Illinois. His name was Black Hawk, just like the Chicago Blackhawks. Black Hawk got a number of Indian groups together, and he was going to attack the white settlers in northern Illinois. Fortunately, one of his young braves was named Chabanah, and Chabanah warned the white people that Black Hawk was coming. And so the war turned out to be not such a big war. But in the meantime, Abraham was elected to be captain of the volunteers from the New Salem area. And so he did serve as a military captain, but he said he was so happy he never had to kill anybody. Another thing that happened to Abe Lincoln in New Salem was he met Anne Rutledge. Her father, James Rutledge, was the co-founder of New Salem. James Rutledge turned his home he created within his home, I should say, a tavern, and he had extra beds for guests. And sometimes Abe slept there. Sometimes Anne ran the tavern. But in any case, they got very, very close together. Some say they got engaged, maybe not. But they were seen all over town, and they seemed to get along extremely well. Unfortunately, Anne died suddenly on August 25th, 1835. She died from typhoid. On the last day of her life, Anne asked if she could talk alone to Abe. So Abe went into her room and sat with her while she died, and they talked. No one knows what they said, but everyone knows that following her death, Abraham went into a very deep depression. The original grave of Anne Rutledge, just a simple grave, is in Petersburg, Illinois. So on your next trip to Illinois, you can go to New Salem and go to Petersburg and so on. One of I think it's kind of interesting that the Anne Rutledge, Abe Lincoln love affair became so popular that a town was created in Pennsylvania called Rutledge, Pennsylvania, in honor of Anne Rutledge. Well, about a year later, Abe got in touch with another girl. Her name was Mary Owens, and they got engaged. And at the point where they were pretty close to getting to being married, Abe said to Mary Owens, if you don't want to marry me, you don't really have to. And she said, okay. That was the end of that engagement. Another thing about New Salem that is very key to Abe Lincoln's life is Mentor Graham. Mentor Graham, also from Kentucky, he waited until the state of Illinois voted down slavery. And that vote took place in 1824. Illinois became a free state by one vote. Pretty exciting. Anyway, Mentor Graham could teach anything at all. He was a teacher for 60 years. But in this case, at any rate, he taught Abe Lincoln everything about grammar, mathematics, surveying, and just anything Lincoln wanted to learn, he just wanted to learn. And the only girl in Mentor Graham's class was Anne Rutledge. That's interesting. And there is a marker that commemorates Mentor Graham. This is in Kentucky, and it tells us that this is the point where he was born. He did a lot for Abraham Lincoln. Now, in the 1830s, becoming a lawyer was a little different than it is today. You didn't necessarily have to go to a law school. You could, but you didn't have to. All you needed to become a lawyer was to find a judge who would say that you had a good moral character. That's it. If you found a judge who would write off on that, you became a lawyer. In Lincoln's case, he actually went to the Illinois Supreme Court and had the court name him a lawyer. And he used to ride the circuit. Boy, did he ride the circuit. He rode, usually he would ride with a judge and maybe some other lawyers, and they would ride up to 400 miles on horseback from town to town to town to try different kinds of cases. And Lincoln preferred sitting outside, and he would, first of all, he would make every effort to make the legal matter simple so that it could be easily understood. And he liked everybody, and everybody liked him. And he became known as Honest Abe during his many years riding that circuit. This was a picture that Abe used as he rode those 400 miles around 14 different counties in the state of Illinois. At the end of his life, he had over 5,000 cases that he had been a part of. One of the best known, and you may know this one already, was the case of Duff Armstrong. Duff Armstrong was the son of Jack Armstrong of the Clary Grove Boys. And Abe took on this case and as the defense for Duff Armstrong. The witness, Charles Allen, had testified that he saw Duff Armstrong that night from 150 feet away, and he could see him clearly from the bright moon. Well, Abe Lincoln whipped out the Farmer's Almanac, which showed clearly that the moon on that night was just a quarter moon, and it was a very dull moon, not possible to see anything. And so he cleared Duff Armstrong, and he did it all free of charge for his mom, or Jack Armstrong's widow. Now we switch a little bit to Lexington, Kentucky. This is the massive home of a very large, wealthy family in Lexington. The girl who grew up there was Mary Todd. She was very well educated. And then in 1839, she decided to move to Illinois and stay with her sister, Mrs. Ninian Edwards. He was the son of the governor of the state. And then she, Mary Todd, met Abraham at a cotillion, and they danced all night. And for the next couple of years, as a matter of fact, they were on and off in love. Finally, on November 4th, 1842, Abraham Lincoln married Mary Todd. Mary might have looked like this on the day of her marriage. There were no pictures taken at the wedding. The wedding was in the home of Ninian Edwards. He wanted no photography. So there are no pictures available of the wedding or anything like that. But we do know that Lincoln gave Mary a locket, and the inside of the ring that he gave her it said, "Love is eternal." They moved into this little place, first of all. They lived on the second floor in an 8x14 room. And this was called the Globe Tavern. Their first son, Robert, was born here in 1843. After that, they moved out and they rented a 3-room cottage for $100 a year. But the site of the Globe Tavern is in Springfield is marked like this. Now, this is 1842. That year, Lincoln, and I should tell you that when Lincoln was a young boy, calling him Abe or Abraham was satisfactory. That was okay. But when he matured, I don't know exactly at what point that was, but when he grew up, he wanted to be called Lincoln. He wanted everyone to call him Lincoln. And frequently, when he signs a document, he signs it as A. Lincoln, and never Abraham. Anyway, in 1842, this man, James Shields, was the auditor of the state of Illinois. And Lincoln did not like where the auditor was taking the state as far as the state money was concerned. So Lincoln would write letters to the editor that were really nasty letters, making fun out of James Shields. And he would sign his letters Rebecca. He showed one of the letters to Mary, and she laughed like crazy. And then she wrote a letter and signed it Kathleen. Well, James Shields was he was puffing blood out of his nose, and so he found out who Rebecca was. And he then challenged Abraham Lincoln to a duel. And they would duel on the Bloody Island in Missouri, where it was still legal to have dueling was legal, but then in most cases it became an illegal act. Well, Abe was the one who was challenged in a duel, so that meant that he could choose the weapons. He chose the greatest broadswords in the United States Army. Very big, very heavy item. He went to Bloody Island and meet James Shields for the duel. And he took his broadsword and he reached up into the tree above Shields' head and whopped off a branch. James Shields said, okay, I get it. And so he just quit. He pulled back. There never was a duel. Well, in 1844, the young Lincolns bought this home at 8th and Jackson Streets in Springfield, Illinois, for $1,500. It's the only home that they ever owned. Their second son, Eddie, was born in this house in 1846. Lincoln always had a law partner, but the one who was with him most often was William Herndon. And when you go to Springfield, make sure that you go to the William Herndon Law Office. He wrote a multi-volume biography of Mr. Lincoln years later. And he was a great law partner. They got along for over 20 years. This picture is only the first photograph ever taken of Abraham Lincoln, first one. And that was in the 1840s. Now, Lincoln had run for different offices that he lost. Now, he lost his first run at the Illinois state legislature. And he ran for a senator a couple times, and he was defeated in those. He once said that being a senator is more important, and it's a better job than being the president. Illinois had a well-known senator and quite a politician. His name was Stephen Douglas. And Stephen Douglas, who was only about 5'4", about the same size as me, I like Steve, he was known as the Little Giant. And he was very, very articulate. Lincoln decided to run against him for office. So he became known as the Giant Killer. And he challenged Stephen Douglas to a set of debates. There were 7 of them. And the debates were all over Illinois. They drew great crowds, great crowds. And in the end, Lincoln lost the election to the Senate, but he became known all over what was then America because the newspapers would carry the debates. And whereas Stephen Douglas was in favor of certain arguments having to do with slavery, Lincoln was totally opposed. Their son, Eddie, was the first of the kids to die. He died in 1850. He wasn't even 4 years old yet when he passed away. And that was a heavy loss on the Lincoln family. There are many quotes from Abraham Lincoln. There are books full of quotes from Abraham Lincoln. Can't go through all of them. But I thought that 1858 was such a good year for him that a couple of quotes from that year kind of tell where he's going. On May 18th, for example, he says, "Welcome or unwelcome, agreeable or disagreeable, whether this nation shall be an entire slave nation is the issue before us." On July 10th in Chicago, he says, "I have always hated slavery. I think as much as any abolitionist." And on August 1st, he said, "As I would not be a slave, so I would not be a master. This expresses my idea of democracy. Whatever differs from this, to the extent of the difference, is no democracy." And so he was a great talker. Now remember, he was, in quotes, uneducated during all this time. This is the room in the state capitol where Lincoln gave what we know as his House divided speech, in which he said, "I believe this government cannot endure permanently, half slave and half free. I do not expect the Union to be dissolved. I do not expect the House to fall, but I do expect it will cease to be divided." That was one of his more brilliant sets of words. He probably had the best speechwriter of any president ever. And that, in part, that was because he wrote his own speeches. as he was running for president in 1860, he went to a place in New York City called the Cooper Union. And when he got there, he spoke about slavery. He argued that the founding fathers would not allow slavery in this age. And this speech was the one that made it possible for him to run for election. Horace Greeley, the editor of the New York Tribune, said his speech was stunningly effective. Well, Abe was nominated for president, and he was named the Republican candidate. The Republican Party is a brand new party, and in May of 1860, Abraham Lincoln was named the Republican candidate, and he would run against Stephen Douglas and two other guys from the South. And of course, he was going to win. Now, a little side story. In 1860, the end of the year, October, 11-year-old girl named Grace Bedell wrote a letter to Mr. Lincoln, who was running for president. And she said, "Let your whiskers grow. You would look so much better because your face is so thin. All the ladies would tease their husbands to vote for you." Well, he appreciated that letter. He started to grow a beard. He wrote a letter back to Grace, thanked her for her suggestion, and his beard got heavier and heavier rather quickly. And then he was elected and nominated for president, and he left Springfield by train. And when he did, he gave what's known as the farewell address. And allow me to read this to you. It's he wrote his speech, as so many of them. It just is all written on hand. You know, he'd write them on scraps of paper and so on. For the farewell to Springfield, he said, "My friends, no one, not in my situation, can appreciate my feeling of sadness at this parting. To this place and the kindness of these people, I owe everything. Here I have lived a quarter of a century and have passed from a young to an old man. Here my children have been born and one is buried. I now leave, not knowing when or whether ever I may return, with a task before me greater than that which rested upon Washington. Without the assistance of that divine being, whoever attended him, I cannot succeed. With that assistance, I cannot fail. Trusting in him who can go with me and remain with you and be everywhere for good, let us confidently hope that all will yet be well. To his care commending you, as I hope in your prayers you will commend me, I bid you an affectionate farewell. On his way to being inaugurated as President of the United States, Lincoln stopped in upstate New York to meet Grace Bedell. And remember, 11-year-old girl, but he took the time to go meet her and to thank her. And these are the statues that tell us about that quick greeting. Now, before Lincoln even before he was elected president, there were threats of assassination and killing him and so on, because the Southerners did not want him to be the president. He took a whistle-stop train towards Washington. In Pittsburgh, he said, I could not help thinking, my friends, as I traveled in the rain through your crowded streets on my way here, that if all the people were in favor of the Union, it can certainly be in no great danger. It will be preserved. Then in New York City, 250,000 people watched his carriage procession, but he was in disguise. His private detective had warned him about the dangers, especially in Baltimore, and so he sometimes wore other clothes. Sometimes they say he even dressed as a woman. But he got there. He got to Missouri. There are 3 pieces of legislation that lead up to the Civil War, and you should know a little bit about them. I'm not going to tell you a lot. But in 1820, there was one law passed called the Missouri Compromise. And what that law said was that slavery could not exist anywhere north of a particular line. Like none of this, there could be no slaves here at all. Then the Kansas-Nebraska Act came in 1854. That Kansas-Nebraska Act had been submitted by Stephen Douglas. And what it said was, let the settlers decide as to whether or not they want to have slaves. And they said further that the Missouri Compromise was altogether illegal. The violence became so fantastic that this became known as Bloody Kansas, and Nebraska's right with it. And there were Union forces and there were secessionist forces, and it was a war going on, a very ugly kind of war. And then the last one, the Dred Scott case of 1857. Dred Scott was a slave, and he was a slave to a military officer who was stationed in Missouri. And Missouri was a slave state. Well, the officer was assigned and he left Missouri. He went to Illinois and Wisconsin, which were free states. And then the officer died, and the court ruled, the United States Supreme Court ruled, that no slave or former slave could ever become a citizen. That is really complicated. But at any rate, it was that kind of thinking that led to secession. And in December of 1860, now that's before Lincoln even becomes president, really, South Carolina seceded from the Union. And it was soon followed by Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas. And they formed their own government. Lincoln is going on with life, and so for his first inaugural speech was okay. It lasted 35 minutes, and he had a fair crowd. But he was sworn in as President of the United States. He immediately chose private secretaries, and their names were John Nicolay and John Hay. And they, to be practical about it, they lived in the White House. And after Lincoln's death, they wrote a multi-volume biography of the president. They were very close to him. Lincoln's vice president was Hannibal Hamlin, who was a senator from the state of Maine and very anti-slave. Well, after he was elected president, almost immediately, on April 12th of 1861, Fort Sumter was attacked. And we're not going to go through the Civil War because that bloody mess was just absolutely horrible. Far more men died in the Civil War than in World War II, for example. But Lincoln, they would win some, they would lose some. In fact, the beginning of the war did not look good for the Union. Lincoln waited until we had a major win before he made some announcements. So in September 17th of 1862, at the Battle of Antietam, General Lee was defeated by General McClellan. In one day, 26,000 men were killed or wounded. And so right after that, on January 1st, 1863, President Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, which set free all slaves in the South. But it wasn't until the 13th Amendment, which came in December of 1865, that all slaves everywhere were freed. The Lincoln family was very close. And when they moved into the White House, besides the boys, and in this picture, let's see, here we got Robert, Willie, and Tad are there. But they also had a dog named Fido, a cat called Tabby, 2 goats named Nanya and Nanko. They always had a horse, and Lincoln used that horse because he used to ride back and forth to a resting place in a army retirement. But in 1862, news came of the death of Willie. Now they had already lost Eddie and now Willie. And Mary went into a deep, deep depression. In fact, it almost killed her. Lincoln kind of ran the army. You know, he would assign different generals to different places all through the war. And in this picture, you see the forerunner to the Secret Service, actually, but Alan Pinkerton, Pinkerton Service on one side, and General McClendon on the other. And they had met and talked about the 13th Amendment, which would come, but it didn't get here in time for Abraham Lincoln to see it. He went to his second inaugural in 1865. And in this speech, this speech lasted 6 minutes. 6 minutes for inaugural. On the day of the speech, it was extremely windy and it was pouring down rain. President Lincoln stepped out for the inauguration. The wind stopped and the sun came out. And everyone considered that a miracle. And it was another great speech. He ended that second inaugural with these words, which you may know: with malice toward none, and charity for all, with firmness in the right, as God gives us to see the right, let us strive on to finish the work we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds, to care for him who shall have borne the battle, and for his widow and his orphan, to do all which may achieve and cherish a just and lasting peace among ourselves and with all nations. And those words are in the Lincoln Memorial. In his second presidency, Lincoln chose Andrew Johnson to be his vice president, and of course he's destined to become the next president of the United States. Abe had always loved his kids, and here he was with Tad reading this book. It's a well-publicized photo, and it was first believed that that he was reading to his son out of the Bible, but actually they were looking at a picture portfolio. But the family still got together. And this is kind of interesting because at this point in time, there are only two sons left, Robert and Ted. Robert wanted his father to give him a commission. He wanted to get into the war. And the president tried to talk him out of it, and he realized he couldn't. So finally he said, okay, I'll get you in. So he did get him a commission as a captain. He immediately assigned him to General Grant. And he contacted Grant, and he said, make sure to keep my son out of trouble. So he made it through the war. Mary, on the other hand, was extremely well known and in fact heavily criticized for the dresses that she used to get. Of the 13 kids in her family, she was one of 13. 8 went with the South, 5 went with the North. But Mary was criticized because at a time of war, she would go out and buy these really splashy clothes. That's the way she loved to dress. And she'd like to buy them from France if she could. In 1863, we had the turning point in the war, the Battle of Gettysburg, a tragic battle that just so many people were slaughtered. And from July 1st to 3rd of 1863. And Abe stood up and he had a speech that he wanted to deliver, even though when he was invited to Gettysburg, he was invited as the second speaker of the day. And his speech, once again, handwritten, and you can get copies of the speech if you wish. They were just scratched out on a piece of paper. He wrote them himself. And let me read this to you. 77 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Now we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation or any nation so conceived and so dedicated can long endure. We are met on a great battlefield of that war. We have come to dedicate a portion of that field as a resting place for those who here gave their lives that that nation might live. It is altogether fitting and proper that we should do so. But in a larger sense, we cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow this ground. The brave men, living and dead, who struggled here have consecrated it, far above our poor power to add or detract. The world will little note nor long remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here. It is for us, the living, rather, to be dedicated here to the unfinished work which they who fought here have thus far so nobly advanced. It is rather for us to be here dedicated to the great task remaining before us, that from these honored dead we take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion, that we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation, under God, shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, and for the people shall not perish from the earth. The monuments at Gettysburg look like this, a beautiful monument. And in the town, it looks like this. This is a picture of Lincoln with General McClellan at the Battle of Antietam. Lincoln loved to go out into the field. He loved to be where the soldiers were. One time he got a bullet right through his hat, but he didn't even know it. And it wasn't too long in time, as time goes by, that April 9th of 1865, that Lee, General Robert E. Lee, surrendered in the Appomattox Courthouse to General Grant. And Robert Lincoln was present at this surrender. And then April, still April, this is April 10th, and it was the last portrait made of the president. And he does look pretty tired in there. Well, the war was over. And so Lincoln asked his wife to come with him and see the show, Our American Cousin, at Ford's Theater. And that was on April 14th. He invited General Grant. Grant said no because he didn't like Mary Lincoln. And so they picked up some other people and they rode together to Ford's Theater. And it happened to be Good Friday when they got there to see the show. He had to go all the way down to the rank of Major Henry Rathbone to get somebody to go to see the play with him. And Henry Rathbone did go there. The thing about him that we need to know, I guess, is that after the attack on the president that night, Henry Rathbone jumped out of his seat immediately and tried to grab the attacker. He used a 7-inch blade and slashed General Rathbone from the elbow to the shoulder, almost to the bone. But Rathbone did grab the attacker and it caused him to trip on his way down to the stage. 18 years later, the same guy was the United States Consul General in Hanover, Germany. He went crazy. He attacked the 3 children that he had, and then he shot and killed his wife. And this was his wife, Clara Harris, who went with them to Ford's Theater that night. But the event from that night just destroyed this guy's life. And so he died in 1911 in an asylum for the criminally insane. His life had been completely broken. The attacker that night was a stage actor, well known, very well known. His name was John W. Booth. And he didn't plan to kill Abraham Lincoln. He was going to kidnap him and then ransom him back. He was hoping that he could get the South to rise again, but that really wasn't possible. Anyway, his plan was to kidnap the president on March 17th, 1865. And the reason was that the president used to go to this old soldiers' home, and he had a place to stay there. He would ride his own horse all alone to go back and forth to the old soldiers' home. And so on March 17th, Booth was going to kidnap him, but as life works, the president didn't go that day. And so he may not have decided to kill the president until the night that it actually happened. Booth fired one shot with his Derringer, a 6-inch weapon. He fired one shot. There were no guards there anywhere to be found. And when he slashed Major Rathbone's arm. He jumped to the stage, and as he did, he broke an ankle. And he was waving, this is his 7-inch blade that was later taken. When he got on the stage, most people say he said, "Sic semper tyrannis," which means thus always to tyrants. Well, of course, the whole theater went crazy. As soon as this happened, there was a 23-year-old Army surgeon, Dr. Charles Leal, and he was just 40 feet away from the Lincoln box. He raced to the box immediately, and he found Lincoln leaning over on Mary. Her dress was covered in blood. The president was technically dead already. His brain had been destroyed. But they carried him across the street to this house, the Peterson boarding house across the street. And they had to lay the president crosswise on the bed because at 6'4", he was too long to fit straight into the bed. Pictures came out, like here's the one. It shows just about everybody was in the room when the president died. And it shows Mary weeping on the bed. Well, the photograph really, actually what happened would look more like this. Mary did cry. She kept crying and crying. Secretary of War, Edmund Stanton, ordered Mary out of the room and said, "Do not ever come back here." Stanton was holding Lincoln's head when he was pronounced dead at 7:22 a.m. And at that point, he said, "Now he belongs to the ages." And Walt Whitman wrote, "O Captain, my Captain, our fearful trip is done. The ship has weathered every wreck. The prize we sought is won. The port is near, the bells I hear, the people all exulting, while follow eyes the steady keel, the vessel grim and daring. But oh heart, 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 oh the bleeding drops of red, where on the deck my captain lies, fallen cold and dead. My captain does not answer, his lips are pale and still. My father does not feel my arm, he has no pulse nor will. My ship is safe and sound, its voyage closed and done. From fearful trip, the victor ship comes in with object won. Exult, O shores, and ring, O bells. But I, with silent tread, walk the spot my captain lies, fallen cold and dead. That same night that John Booth was supposed to get the president, other members in his group were supposed to kill other people. Lewis Payne, sometimes called Lewis Powell, was supposed to kill the Secretary of State, William Stewart. William Stewart, I mean, this is really a weird thing. William Stewart had an accident while riding in a carriage, and because of that, he was wearing some kind of an apparatus around most of his body, and parts of it were made of metal. And so when Lewis Powell was slashing him with the knife, he thought he was killing him, but he really wasn't. And he cut 8 other people around the secretary. But anyway, he was involved with the attempt. John Wilkes Booth, in the meantime, ran across the stage, hopped on his horse, and took off. There was immediate reward offered for his capture. One of the men who was famous in the episode was Dr. Samuel Mudd. And Dr. Samuel Mudd might have been just a doctor doing what a doctor does. He repaired his broken ankle. But he did know John Wilkes Booth, and he trusted John Wilkes Booth, and he allowed him to spend one night in his home, but he may not have even known what had happened at the theater. So anyway, after this was all over, Samuel Mudd missed hanging by one vote. He got life at Fort Jefferson in the Dry Tortugas. And 4 years later, there was a yellow fever outbreak at the prison, and Dr. Mudd treated most of the patients, as many as he possibly could, and so he was released for that kind of work. In the meanwhile, this is the trail that John Wilkes Booth took from the theater in the north down to Dr. Mudd's place, and then he got down to the farm, and to the Garrett farm. And when he got there, he went into a barn. The barn was set afire, actually, by members of the 16th New York Cavalry, who tracked Booth all the way to the Garrett farm. And one of the other conspirators was with Booth. His name was David Herold, and Herold surrendered, but Booth would not. Somebody set the barn on fire with Booth in it. They wanted him alive. They wanted him to come out, but he refused. And then a member of the cavalry, Sergeant Boston Corbett, fired one shot through a crack in the barn wall, and he shot Booth in the neck, which paralyzed him. So they grabbed his body, took him up to the farmhouse, and that's where John Wilkes Booth died. And he was buried in Washington, D.C. at first underneath the floor of a prison. But then a number of years later, I think it was 9, his family said, "Can't we have his body?" And so the government gave his body to his family, and they took him to Baltimore, where they have a family plot. And but he was kind of set aside and just buried on the lot, the plot that goes with their family, but nothing big, just a small nothing grave. And when visitors come to see that grave today, they leave Lincoln pennies instead of flowers. The four people, there were actually 8 involved, but 4 people was decided should hang. And so on July 7th, 1865, at 1:26 p.m., 4 conspirators were hanged. And they were hanging for 25 minutes. People who wanted to watch had to pay for tickets to get in to see the hanging. Those who were in the hanging, this was David Herold, and he was the one who went with Booth to Virginia. The second one was this nice-looking guy, George Atzerodt. He was supposed to kill Vice President Andrew Johnson, but he chickened out at the last minute and just left. The third one was Lewis Payne, and he was supposed to murder the Secretary of State Surratt, but he failed. He tried, but he failed. And the fourth one was Mary Surratt. Mary Surratt owned a boarding house where the conspirators regularly met. Now, whether she was a part of the conspiracy or not, I don't know, but the court thought so, And so they hanged her. She was the first woman hanged by American court. There were 4 other people who were involved. One guy, his name was Edmund Spangler. He was a stagehand, and Booth, remember, was a great actor. And so Booth had said to Edmund, would you do me a favor? I'm going to be going to theater tonight, and when I leave, I'd like to leave my horse back here. Would you hold it for me? And he said, sure. So he held his horse, and he got 6 years. And so, anyway, that was enough of that. The train that took Lincoln back. Lincoln wanted to be buried in Springfield. That was what as far as Lincoln was concerned, Springfield was his home. Springfield, Illinois. It took the train 13 days to travel the 1,700 miles. It always traveled between 5 and 20 miles per hour. So it wasn't a speeding train. It made numerous stops with thousands of people at every single stop. Willie's body was in the car with the president's body, and they were in a special Pullman car. There were 9 cars in all in the train. 1 was for baggage, and 7 were for the funeral entourage. So it's estimated that 1/3 of the population of America saw Lincoln's train. Another over 1 million people saw his body, because as the train stopped in special towns, they would take Lincoln's body out, and people would want to see him for one last time. When he came into towns, various towns, this is in upstate New York, but this is a number of cities where his body was shown to the people, were just absolutely packed. When they got to Chicago, they built this arch to allow Lincoln's body to come into Illinois, really. And his body was viewed by 7,000 people per hour that they had there. Then eventually they took his body, put it in a very special, elegant hearse that was made with gold, silver, and crystal, and they drove all over Springfield. Only Robert Lincoln and a cousin, John Hanks, were there. Mary was still in D.C. She was still in deep, deep mourning, and why wouldn't she be? And Lincoln's horse, he had this horse, he had many horses, but this one his real name was Robin, but he was known as Old Bob, and the president had Old Bob for 17 years. And he was dressed up and he walked behind the hearse. He and the dog Fido were sent to Springfield so that they could be there when the president came home. And eventually they took him to Oak Ridge Cemetery in Springfield. And he would be buried among his friends, as that's the way he felt about it. And so his first burial took place on May 4th, 1865, and his coffin was placed on a marble slab. Willie was also placed inside the same tomb, and the crowd watched as they closed gates of iron over heavy wooden doors, so the tomb was secure. But that wasn't the case, because in 1876, a couple of guys tried to steal the body, but they were caught in the act, and so the body was saved. Robert Lincoln was the only Lincoln who grew to adulthood. And as a matter of fact, he had a great life of his own. He lived until 1926 at age 83. Yeah. He went to Chicago, and then he was with Mary and Tad. Tad was still alive, but the younger sons, Eddie and Willie, were gone, and Tad lived to the age of 18. Robert became the Secretary of War under President Garfield, and then he became the president of the Pullman Train Car Company. He had a mansion in the state of Vermont. That's where he chose to live. And when he was asked one time about what did he remember most about his father, he said, "I remember him either packing or unpacking his saddlebags as he went riding around the state." So he didn't get along too terribly good with his father. However, when the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C. was dedicated in 1922, Robert Lincoln was there. And Robert Lincoln was also there in the cemetery when, in 1901, he wanted his father's tomb to be made more secure. For one reason or another, and I never understood this, but his body had been moved 17 times prior to going into this particular tomb. He was buried 10 feet below ground and encased in 9,000 pounds of concrete, so that it would be unlikely that anyone would try to get there again. It's a beautiful cemetery, and this memorial is quite beautiful. And upstairs, if you walk up the stairs there, you'll see that the 4 major wartime services are represented. And today, the park, the cemetery, that part of the cemetery, the tomb, is visited by over 1 million people a year. And almost every one of them will touch Lincoln's nose, because that's supposed to bring good luck in there, and we always do. And this is what you see inside. To get to this point, you have a pretty long walk, and actually Mary and the 3 boys are all buried with Abraham. But after I should point out that after his death, eventually Mary decided to go live in Paris, France. She took Tad with her, and they went to Paris for several years, and then they finally came back to Illinois, and then Tad died. When he died, one thing was clear: there were no pictures, no photos of the president and Mary together. So people would create them, and they would just take loose pictures and put them together. And this would be another example. You got 2 separate pictures, but then they were joined together to make this picture so it looks like they were together. I don't know why that is, but it's just a shame there were no pictures of them together. Another thing that happened is that people would find a body form that they really liked. In this case, it's Andrew Jackson. And they take the body of Andrew Jackson, they put Lincoln's head on him. And they would do that with not only Andrew Jackson, other people as well. Robert got angry with his mother because of all of the spending. She was just throwing money away. And he got very, very upset with her. And so he had her placed in the Bellevue Sanitarium in Batavia, Illinois. But 3 months after she was placed there, She escaped and then proved her sanity, and so she kind of got away with it. But when I think of sadness and people who might be sad, I think of Mary Lincoln. And I think, why wouldn't she go insane if that's the issue? But why wouldn't she break down? After all, she had her family split in the first place. Her family split, 8 to the south, 5 to the north. Then she lost her first son before the age of 4, her second son at the age of 12, her third son, Tad, at age 18, and only Robert remained. And besides that, she was sitting right next to her husband when he had his brains blown out. So that's kind of sad. Lincoln, this is a photo of Lincoln that's used on the penny, and there have been millions and millions of pennies printed, and it's always, there's a different story on the back side of the penny. So the next time you get a bunch of pennies, look not only at the Lincoln photo, but look at the back side and see what the message might be. This picture, a little different. This picture is the one that was used for the $5 bill. And so next time you get $5 in your pocket, you can take a look at that picture. That picture was also used, for example, in this particular puzzle. Puzzles and games, anything to remember President Lincoln was very important. One of the most popular was the Lincoln log set, which I think is still around today, but it's been available almost always for his whole life, remembering that Lincoln was once a log cutter, rail splitter, a worker on the farm, and always poor. And then the next that I wanted to show you, the number of stamps. And you might want to read this one. The stamps come in different denominations, and they always have a different message on it. This one is about slavery. And then here, the Lincoln-Douglas debates. And you know, when you take your vacation to Illinois, you might even say, geez, I wonder what those towns are like anymore. And you might go to those 7 towns and see how they are marked for the site of the debate that took place there. And this was a nice airmail stamp for the people, a great one. And stamps were not only issued in America. This one is from Honduras, and it shows the assassination of the president, which is kind of interesting. And this one is from Liberia, the African nation that was founded by Americans. And then lastly, in the stamp issue, is this one from Rwanda. Another way we remember Lincoln is from the Lincoln Highway. The Lincoln Highway is sometimes lined up and connected with Route 66, but the Lincoln Highway was created to run from coast to coast. And all along that highway, you'll see markers of one kind or another to remember Abraham Lincoln. And then you see how many Lincoln Avenues there are, or how many Lincoln Parks, or how many cities known as Lincoln. And across Illinois, there are markers all the way, very distinct markers. And this is another one. And there, along the Lincoln Highway. And finally, even in a theater. Go see the theater. There have been several Lincoln movies made. You've probably seen some of them. This was one of the smaller busts made, but there are death masks and hand masks and all kinds of small busts that are available. When you go to Springfield, you'll go, of course, to the Lincoln Museum, and you'll see all kinds of stuff. And statues everywhere. Let's not forget Abraham Lincoln. Don't forget that he was the one who issued the Emancipation. And this was one of the very first statues made for Lincoln, the Emancipation Statue, one of the first. And yet it was criticized by many people because it showed the slave at the feet of Lincoln. And that's not what he meant. This is one of the circuit rider little statues. This one is from the cemetery where he's buried. But there's the statues of the circuit rider are like almost everywhere. This is a large one. And this large statue, hard to believe, is located in Lincoln City, Oregon. Beautiful statue. Then from Lincoln City, Oregon, we go to East Hartford, Connecticut, where they have a wire statue of Old Bob. Or it could be one of his other horses, but we think of it as Old Bob. And once again, we think of Lincoln and horses, the life-size statue, a bronze statue, Lincoln, Old Bob. That's at the Soldiers' Home in Washington, D.C. And this, we're almost back to his home, Hodgenville, Kentucky. The Lincoln College in Illinois, and Lincoln, there's a Lincoln City and there's a Lincoln College, says, "I shall prepare myself. Someday my chance will come." This is one of my favorites because it's the Lincoln statue in Lincoln Park in Chicago. It's a beautiful, beautiful statue. And if you don't like statues, maybe someday you'll get over to Mount Rushmore, where you can see this is the president carved out of rock in South Dakota, but a really good job. The biggest of the memorials is the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C. On these steps, these are the steps where Martin Luther King Jr. gave his "I Had a Dream" speech. And inside the Lincoln Memorial, you'll find the words of the Gettysburg Address and the second inaugural on the walls inside. And a seated president, always remembering. And the fact that we have a Lincoln automobile, we've got an aircraft carrier called the Lincoln, we've got ballistic missile submarine, we had a Liberty ship. I mean, everywhere you go, Lincoln, Lincoln, Lincoln. And when you go to Illinois, of course, when you get to the border, you'll see, "Welcome to Illinois, land of Lincoln." So we'll end by going back to Hingham, Massachusetts, to see this lovely statue of a seated President Lincoln. Thank you very much for watching the show. I appreciate that. And I want to thank METV, all of the men and women of METV who make this show possible. Thank you. God bless you all, and God bless America.